Right, 20 minutes before 8 here on this Tuesday morning. So, appearing before the State Capture Commission of Inquiry yesterday, Lord Peter Hein advised the Commission to look into the role played by banks in facilitating money laundering and illegal financial flows out of the country. Hain said local banks should have seen the signs and stopped some of the transactions, and therefore they should be held liable. He spoke out against criminal complicity by some of the world's leading economies, international corporations, the banking sector, and professionals for enabling corruption. The Banking Association declined to comment, unfortunately, but in studio with us we've got Jerry Vilakazi. He's a business leader and former CEO of Business Unity South Africa, to talk to us a little bit about this and the corporate world in general. Good to see you, and thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
So you saw a lot of snippets coming out yesterday from Lord Hain's testimony and his allegations basically saying that banks should have picked up these suspicious payments to Guptas and suggest that they must be held liable. What do you think? Should they be held liable?
I think being held liable really is the ultimate decision that must follow what comes out of the process. For me, what is important from what he raised is that there are questions that we should be asking. Is that those that have got oversight roles, whether it's in the banking institutions, whether it's in the companies themselves that were involved, whether it's in the regulatory institutions, did they not see the signs? And it's a valid question that we should all be asking as more and more information comes up in the commission, and as we see what has been going on. I think the institutions really have to answer the questions. Were the signs not there? We know that there are mechanisms to monitor the movement of funds from one institution to the other. We know that the institutions have got the capacity to pick up when there are suspicious transactions that are happening. And the questions are, why were they not picked up in time?
Yeah, or were they? And they just pulled a blind eye and said, well, let's just leave it. Perhaps, there's more to it than meets the eye, and that there was involvement. Because, Lord Hain went as far as to actually say yesterday that foreign governments must assume responsibility for monumental looting in South Africa, because this was a form of money laundering from, South Africa through our banks to other countries. Again, a big accusation.
I think for me what is important, he has raised very significant, important questions that we should be asking. I think all institutions that have got a role and a responsibility to ensure good governance have to answer the questions. But however, I would be cautious to come to a conclusion at this stage because the commission has not yet finalized its work. Once the details have been sifted through of what we've been hearing and conclusions have been made by the commission, it will be very important. I think if we're going to address and avert any repeat of such incidents, we've got to go through the entire system. It's not only those that would have committed the misdeeds, but the processes, the systems must have safeguards, and we know they do. We know there are regulations right from the reserve banks. We know that the banks themselves are under strict supervision and monitoring. We know there are also directors that have got fiduciary duties to play oversight in what is happening within the banks. We also know that we as stakeholders, as the public and as shareholders, have a responsibility, moral duty to ensure that there is compliance with all the regulations that have been put in place.
An interesting suggestion that he brought forward yesterday, basically saying that he suggested that there should be penalties for banks and professionals for their inability to self-regulate and not identify criminal activities, and they should be liable for all of this. Would that responsibility, or should that responsibility, land on them? I know these are all allegations. We're waiting for the money trail and all of the evidence to come forward. But, again, just in sort of now that we know that this was happening, in hindsight, should they be responsible for paying that money back?
Absolutely. I think the question that he's raising, what now? I know that many people tend to be very skeptical about commissions because information comes out. And then when people await what happens thereafter, too often they get disappointed. I think if there is anything that will come out of this commission, is for us to then look through the entire system and say where the system failures. And once we've identified those, you've got to hold people accountable.
Yeah.
If we don't hold people accountable, we actually propel and keep on passing on the same misdemeanors. If there are misdemeanors, anybody who has been involved has to be held accountable. And thus, I think the Commission's work is very vital for this country, because while it has focused purely in a particular time period and particular companies, but it has raised questions that require us as a country to look broadly beyond the companies that have been focused on, because we have seen some of the things that have happened even in JSE listed companies where shareholders and other stakeholders have suffered great loss. And it is important for us as a country because the state is the biggest procurer of services in this country from the private sector. And therefore we need to get this thing right.
I mean, I have done, through my business, some work with government. The hoops I've had to jump through, the forms I've got to fill out, the procedures you have to do just to be able to qualify to do a small job with government. There are so many regulations already in place, and I think people that do work with government, they know exactly what I'm talking about. And yet, there is so much corruption that's happening at SOEs. How does this happen? I mean, can you even put more regulations in place? Or what everybody is suspecting here, people at the top are complicit and they know exactly what's going on and they push this through.
I think sometimes we use regulation as an excuse for not addressing what we all know. I do think we've got sufficient regulation to impose and to discipline those that commit misdemeanors. But sometimes we build regulation over regulation when the existing regulation is already serving the purpose of exposing misdemeanors. But when we fail to deal with those misdemeanors, we then look at how can we create another regulation. And sometimes I get this feeling that actually the creation of policies is an excuse for extending time before we deal with the real issue. The fact of the matter is, for instance, we hear serious allegations that we're hearing publicly, and I call them allegations at this stage because we have not yet seen the prosecuting institutions coming in, the NPA coming in and acting on those. And I think, yes, it is true, there is no institution that is regulated like the state in terms of doing business with the state. But it is people that commit misdemeanors. And people tend to look at what will happen if I cross this line. If they see that I can cross the line and still continue, people will always cross the line.
Yeah, they will. And that's exactly what I think Lord Hain was saying yesterday, is that it's individuals. At the end of the day, corporates are made up of individuals, and they may have all the rules in place and everything is there to protect the company, to protect the SOE, to protect the business, but it is a corrupt individual that can just let these things filter through. And that's where the big problem comes in. And these people must be held to account. But will they? And that's something that we need to see coming out of state capture, but just in general going forward.
I think it depends on us. I think as a nation, we accept things we shouldn't accept. We accept appointments in key positions of people that we have serious questions about, whose integrity is questionable, but we become comfortable with that. And when they leave out what they know best, we then get shocked. I think if we're going to address these problems, we've got to deal with the way we appoint people in SOEs, the way we appoint directors in the boards of SOEs and government agencies, but also in the private sector, because there's no corruption within government institutions alone. It's with the private sector. The private sector, we've seen tightening is becoming more difficult for companies, for instance, to get directors on the board, because now people realize what they accept by accepting being a director of the company. The JSE, since the evolution of the corporate governance regulations after the Enrons in the early 2000s, have tightened listing requirements. And we know that in government, to do business, networks, who you know, people tell you openly, who you know matters. But the fact is, if you take in private environment, I can't, as a director of a company, expose information to you that is not public information. I'm in breach of the law. And until we see enforcement agencies, even in the public, in SOEs, the directors that have got fiduciary responsibility, I just think sometimes directors in the SOEs get away with murder. And frankly speaking, sometimes I wonder whether we need some of these commissions. We've got enough institutions that can deal with this thing. It looks to me that as if, and that is the point that Peter is raising, sometimes you get a sense that there's a global gentleman's agreements. The reality is that we have all stood up at this point, because when we saw and we read and heard what the Guptas are alleged to have done, it sparked an anger that suddenly has made us up to stand up. But even in this environment, we're still not looking beyond the Guptas.
Indeed, and that's the reality. I could talk to you all morning. I really could. I'm so sorry we have to wrap the interview. And the reality is there were red flags all along, and nobody did anything about it. It was only towards the end that people started standing up and looking holier than thou, when the signs were there for many, many years. Jerry, thank you. Thanks for talking to us. Interesting testimony yesterday at the inquiry, the state capture inquiry, and certainly we wait to see what comes of it. Jerry Vilakazi is the business leader and former CEO of BUSA, talking to us about Lord Peter Hein's testimony at the State Capture Commission on the role of banks, business and professionals in state capture. All right.